There was a time during the Cold War when the most dangerous battles weren't fought with weapons, but with information. What you knew about your enemy could determine everything: their capabilities, their intentions, their next move. And in a world where nuclear war could begin without warning, not knowing was the greatest threat of all. At the center of that uncertainty was a single question: what was really happening inside the Soviet Union? Because behind closed borders, beyond radar screens, and far from Western observation, the Soviet military was growing. Missiles, bombers, nuclear weapons. But how many? How advanced? And how ready? No one could say with certainty. And that uncertainty created fear. Because in the Cold War, fear wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. If the United States underestimated Soviet capabilities, it could fall behind. If it overestimated them, it could escalate unnecessarily. Either way, the risk increased. What was needed wasn't speculation. It was proof. This is the story of the American spy plane that flew over Moscow, the aircraft that changed intelligence forever and nearly triggered a global crisis. In the early years of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union existed in a state of constant tension. Two superpowers, two competing systems. Each tried to understand the other without revealing too much of itself. But the Soviet Union was largely closed to the outside world. Information was tightly controlled. Foreign access was limited, and traditional intelligence methods struggled to penetrate that barrier. Satellites didn't yet exist in a meaningful way. Human intelligence was difficult to obtain, and signals intelligence had limits. The result was a dangerous gap. American leaders were making decisions based on incomplete information, estimates, assumptions, worst-case scenarios. And in some cases, those assumptions suggested that the Soviet Union was advancing faster than expected. The idea of a missile gap began to take hold. The fear that the United States might be falling behind in nuclear capabilities. Whether true or not, the perception alone was enough to influence strategy. And in that environment, one solution emerged. If you couldn't access information from the ground, you would collect it from the sky. The concept was simple: an aircraft capable of flying higher than any interceptor, higher than most radar systems could effectively track, equipped with cameras powerful enough to capture detailed images from extreme altitude, an aircraft that could fly directly over Soviet territory and return with proof. But the risk was enormous, because if it failed, if the aircraft were detected, or worse, shot down, it wouldn't just be a technological failure. It would be a political crisis, a direct violation of Soviet airspace, an act that could escalate tensions instantly. Still, the need for information outweighed the risk, because without it, every decision was a guess. And guesses in a nuclear standoff could be fatal. The aircraft that would carry that mission was unlike anything before it. Lightweight, high altitude, designed not for speed or combat, but for reach, for the ability to fly where no one else could. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where the most critical missions were carried out in silence, far above the battlefield, consider subscribing, because what this aircraft would soon attempt was something no pilot had ever done before. Because flying over hostile territory was one thing. Flying directly over Moscow was something else entirely. And once that mission began, there would be no margin for error. The aircraft that would carry out that mission was built around a single idea: go higher than anything else in the sky, higher than Soviet fighters, higher than their missiles, higher than their radar could reliably track. It was long, narrow, and unlike any traditional military aircraft, lightweight to an extreme, with wings that stretched wide, designed to generate lift in thin air where other aircraft simply could not operate. This was not a fighter, not a bomber. It was something entirely different, a machine built for one purpose: to see without being seen. Inside, the technology was just as critical as the aircraft itself. High-resolution cameras capable of capturing detailed images from altitudes above 70,000 feet. Equipment designed to photograph missile sites, airfields, factories. Anything that could reveal the true strength of the Soviet Union. Because this mission wasn't about speed. It was about clarity. For the pilots, Flying this aircraft required a different kind of discipline. At those altitudes, the margin between flying and falling was extremely small. Too slow and the aircraft would stall. Too fast and structural limits could be exceeded. The difference between the two could be just a few knots. Pilots called it the coffin corner. A narrow envelope where precision wasn't optional. It was survival. They wore pressure suits, not for comfort, but because at those heights, the atmosphere could not sustain life. A loss of cabin pressure would be fatal within seconds. Every mission required preparation at the highest level, because once airborne, there would be no support, no escort, no protection, just one aircraft, alone, over hostile territory. The missions began cautiously. Flights along the edges of Soviet airspace, testing radar responses, observing how defenses reacted. Each mission provided information, not just about the ground below, but about the systems trying to detect the aircraft. And at first, the results were exactly what had been hoped for. The aircraft flew above most threats. Soviet fighters could not reach it. Missile systems struggled to track it effectively. And the images it brought back were unlike anything seen before. Clear, detailed, accurate. For the first time, American intelligence could see inside the Soviet Union. Air bases, industrial facilities, missile installations. The unknown was becoming known. And with that knowledge came something powerful. Clarity. The feared missile gap began to be reassessed. Some threats were real. Others had been overestimated. Decisions could now be made based on evidence, not assumption. And that changed everything. Because in the Cold War, information wasn't just valuable. It was stabilizing. It reduced the chance of overreaction. It prevented unnecessary escalation. It allowed strategy to be grounded in reality. Mission after mission, the aircraft continued to fly, deeper, farther, more ambitious routes, until eventually, the missions reached a point that had once seemed unthinkable. Flights directly over the heart of the Soviet Union, over its most sensitive locations, over its capital, Moscow. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where a single mission could shift the balance of power, consider subscribing, because what came next would test not just the aircraft, but the limits of the entire strategy. Because each successful flight increased confidence, but it also increased risk. Because the Soviet Union wasn't standing still. Its defenses were improving, its radar systems adapting, its missile technology advancing, and sooner or later, the balance between altitude and threat would begin to change. And when it did, the mission would no longer be invisible. It would become a confrontation. At first, the missions continued as planned. The aircraft climbed, crossed the border, and entered Soviet airspace alone. High above the Earth, where the sky darkened and the curvature of the planet became visible, everything seemed as it always had. Calm, controlled, untouchable. Below, radar systems tracked faint signals. Interceptors were scrambled, missile crews prepared. But once again, the aircraft remained out of reach. Or at least, that's how it appeared. Because while the flights had been successful, they had also revealed something to the Soviet Union. That their airspace was being penetrated. That their most sensitive installations were being observed. That the United States had found a way to see what was meant to remain hidden. And that realization triggered a response. Investment, acceleration, a determination to close the gap. New radar systems were deployed, improved tracking capabilities, and most importantly, a new generation of surface-to-air missiles. Weapons designed not just to reach high altitudes, but to destroy targets that had once been considered unreachable. For a time, the aircraft still held the advantage. It flew, it photographed, it returned, but the margin was shrinking. And then the moment came. Another mission, another flight deep into Soviet territory. The aircraft climbed to altitude, crossed the border, and began its path over some of the most heavily defended regions in the Soviet Union. Inside, the pilot followed procedures exactly. Course, altitude, speed, everything as planned. But this time, the environment was different. On the ground, radar tracked the aircraft more precisely. Missile batteries were alerted, calculations made, and for the first time, the solution was within reach. The missile launched, rising rapidly, guided by radar, closing the distance. Inside the cockpit, there was little warning. At that altitude, threats were often invisible until it was too late. And then, impact. The aircraft was hit, damaged beyond recovery, control lost, and in that moment, one of the most secret missions of the Cold War became impossible to hide. The pilot ejected, descending into hostile territory, captured, alive, and with that, everything changed, because what had once been denied could now be proven. The United States had been flying surveillance missions deep inside the Soviet Union. Not speculation, not accusation, but fact. The aircraft, the pilot, the equipment, all in Soviet hands. The reaction was immediate, public, explosive. The Soviet Union announced the incident, condemned the violation, demanded accountability, and suddenly, what had been a covert operation became an international crisis. Inside the United States, the situation was critical. Statements had already been made, denials issued, but now, those denials could no longer hold, because the evidence was undeniable, and the consequences extended far beyond intelligence. Diplomatic relations were affected, negotiations disrupted, trust, already fragile, was pushed even further, because in the Cold War, exposure wasn't just embarrassment, it was escalation. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where a single moment can shift the course of global politics, consider subscribing, because what followed wasn't just fallout, it was a turning point, because the mission had revealed the truth, but it had also revealed something else, that even the most advanced technology could not remain untouchable forever. And when that protection disappears, the cost can be immediate and global. In the end, the mission succeeded and failed at the same time, because before the aircraft was shot down, it had already changed everything. It had answered the questions that mattered most. The Soviet Union's capabilities were no longer a mystery. Missile sites had been photographed, air bases mapped, production facilities identified. The fear missile gap had been clarified, and in many cases corrected. Decisions that had once been based on uncertainty could now be made with confidence. That alone reshaped the balance of the Cold War, because when leaders understand the reality of their opponent, they're less likely to act on fear, less likely to escalate based on assumptions, more likely to maintain control. But the cost of that clarity became visible the moment the aircraft fell from the sky, the pilot captured, the mission exposed, the operation undeniable. For the Soviet Union, it was proof of intrusion, a violation of sovereignty, a public demonstration that their most protected areas had been penetrated, and they used it politically, strategically, as leverage on the global stage. For the United States, it was a moment of reckoning. The intelligence had been invaluable, but the exposure carried consequences. Diplomatic tensions increased, negotiations stalled, and trust, already fragile, became even harder to maintain, because in the Cold War, secrecy was power, but once revealed, it could become a liability. Still, despite the fallout, the mission left a lasting impact. It proved that high-altitude reconnaissance was possible, that technology could overcome barriers once thought impenetrable, that information could be gathered directly, even in the most restricted environments. And that lesson didn't disappear. It evolved, because soon after, new systems would emerge. Satellites, more advanced reconnaissance platforms, capabilities that would continue the mission without crossing borders in the same way. But those systems were built on what had been learned here, on the risks taken, on the missions flown, on the aircraft that proved it could be done. Because before space-based surveillance, there was a pilot, alone, at the edge of the atmosphere, flying over one of the most heavily defended regions on Earth, carrying nothing but cameras and the weight of a decision that could change everything. In the Cold War, that kind of mission mattered, not because it showed power, but because it revealed truth. And truth, in a world defined by uncertainty, was one of the most powerful tools of all. For more stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because some of the most important battles in history weren't fought with weapons. They were fought with information,